Hello, First Church. It is me again, Trevor, the associate pastor here at the church. And I got another look at Lament with you all. We're going to talk a little bit about Lamentations chapter 3. Now, I love this book, but out of all of the parts of this wonderfully constructed and deep, heart-wrenching book, chapter 3 is my favorite. I remember when I was a little boy, I had a nightlight in my room, and I not only wanted it, I needed it to sleep. Total darkness when I was a little kid was something that was terrifying to me. I didn't know what was out there in the room. There were terrors trying to get me in my closet or under my bed. And I remember when my parents first took the nightlight out of my room, I begged them to bring it back. I begged them. And this is where we see the people of God in Jeremiah in these verses of Lamentations chapter 3. Jeremiah readily admits that he is experiencing what we in the business call a dark night of the soul. He knows of the light that the people of God have experienced, that they used to walk in. He remembers it, but he's no longer there. And we know that's something that God invited creation to from the start. He invited it into light. Gospel of John says that in him was the light of life, and it was the light of men. And that light shines into the darkness, and the darkness can't overcome it, right? But this peace and prosperity that we've read about all the way back in chapter 1, it's mentioned once again that it's no more, that light doesn't seem to be there anymore. And Jeremiah goes so far as to even think about whether he can trust God and be confident in his faith at this point. And maybe you've been there before. I certainly have. The prophet, he feels darkness and isolation and a lack of hope. And so for the people during this time, there's a lot of darkness. There's a lot of isolation. And the questions are being asked are, is this going to be forever? Is this going to be forever? And as we move here further into the verse, there's kind of a peak here that we're going to arrive at. And we're almost there in that next section, but we're not quite. There's hope. There begins to be a glimmer of hope as we move through this chapter. And I love this short transition between the affliction of the people and the hope of the Lord. There's beginning to be a shift in the viewpoint of the prophet to acknowledge that, yes, God was maybe afflicting them. He was giving them a just punishment. But God alone could also help them in that place of darkness. God alone was the basis and the hope of Jeremiah and ultimately the people here. And so even in the following section, it's really the culmination of the chapter. And even the book, there's this huge gospel theme that screams at us in verses 22 through 36. Saying, it is because of the faithful love of God that we are not destroyed. It is good to wait on the salvation of the Lord. And despite everything that they were experiencing, God was still good. His plan was to restore his people. And so in this culmination of the message to a broken and wandering people, we see yet another piece of God's heart uncovered, that he will not leave his people where they are forever. There is a hope that God will take action. There is a hope that God will continue to show mercy as he has done for his people in the past. And we see this forthcoming vision of God's grace and mercy that would be poured out for the sin and rebellion of this people. And I believe that a huge highlight, pause right now, go read John 3:16. It's not in our text today, obviously. It's not in Lamentations 3, but I want you to pause and I want you to go read that because it gives you a good idea and lens through which to view this chapter. God is an anchor for the souls of us as his people, as his believers, a firm and secure refuge for those who put their hope and trust in him. And as we go into that next section, I think it's huge to remember that a big part of lament is repentance. A legitimate call of the people back to God only happens when there's two things that take place. Number one, which we've talked about in previous videos, is a recognition of the sovereignty and holiness of God that allows us to lament our sin properly. But it's also when we place our hope and our trust in God again. So at its base, sin is taking the hope and trust that we've placed in God and placing it in ourselves, in our strength, our knowledge. You can go on with that, or whatever. And once those two steps take place, when we acknowledge how holy God is and we acknowledge our own, lament our sin and put our trust in God again, I believe that we're ready to step into the humble heart and headspace and turn to God. And so in finality to this chapter, there's a different view and type of lament happening. It's a hopeful lament. And obviously there's still mourning that's taking place. It's still important, but they're looking to God through all of it. It's no longer just lamenting what's happening and settling into it and wallowing into it. It's lamenting with a purpose. It's lamenting by seeing who God is and what he's doing and reaching out to him through that. And Jeremiah reaches out to God in verse 55, and God draws near and answers. He says, don't be afraid. And I want to point out here that there is hope that God would remove them from the situation and pay back those who had persecuted him in the future. But there's nothing through the rest of the book that says that God removed them from that. God in this moment is not a defender. He's not necessarily a rescuer, because that's not what's needed. God in this moment is a comforter. And so as we finish this video, another video about Lent and this idea, this process of lament, my question for you is this. What are you lamenting right now in your life that you need God's comfort?